The morning light was barely creeping through my kitchen blinds when my granddaughter stood there, arms crossed, announcing she was quitting her job and expected me to carry her life for her. My coffee turned cold in my hands as a wave of disbelief washed over me, heavy and sharp, like the room itself had tilted. My heartbeat felt loud enough to fill the silence she left hanging. If you've ever trusted someone only to feel the ground shift beneath you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen more often than we admit. In that moment, I didn't know whether to comfort her or protect myself, and that hesitation cost me more than I could have imagined. Let me show you how it all began. I still remember the way the room felt when my granddaughter walked in that morning, her voice steady in a way that told me she had already made up her mind. She said she was done working, that the job was stressing her out, and she expected me to carry her for a while. In that moment, it was like the floor shifted under me. I had spent years trying to give her stability, trying to be the safe place she could always return to. And suddenly I was being told that my role was to fund her stepping away from responsibility altogether. I felt this mix of disbelief and dread settle in my chest. Something inside me whispered that this wasn't just a bad day or a moment of frustration. This was the spark that would light a much bigger fire. The entitlement in her eyes, the certainty in her tone, it all felt so foreign to the girl I helped raise. I stood there trying to steady myself, trying to understand how we had reached this point. And as I listened, a heavier truth pressed in on me. This wasn't the beginning. This had been building for a long time. To make sense of what came next, I have to start with how we got here. When I look back, I realize this didn't start with that one moment. It began months earlier, when my granddaughter showed up at my place in Denver with a suitcase that looked heavier than she did. She told me she just needed a little time to get back on her feet, and my heart softened the way it always has for her. I've lived alone for years, and the idea of having someone in the house again felt comforting, even if I knew it meant adjusting my routines. At first, I told myself her late mornings and long afternoons scrolling on her phone were just signs of exhaustion. She had been through a rough stretch, and I didn't want to judge her too quickly. I've always believed that family should offer a safe place to land, and I tried to be that for her. I gave her space, tried to encourage her gently, and convinced myself that she would find her rhythm again once the dust settled. But little things started to chip away at that hope. The way she brushed off small responsibilities. The way she acted like groceries simply appeared. The subtle expectation that my quiet retirement savings could be stretched to cover 2 people instead of 1. None of it felt malicious, just entitled in a way I didn't recognize. Still, I let it slide. I told myself it was temporary. I didn't want to be the one to push her away. I see now that those early signs were pointing towards something bigger, something I wasn't ready to admit yet. And that's exactly where things began to shift. It didn't happen all at once. It was this slow creep, like water rising around my ankles before I even realized the floor was wet. In the beginning, I told myself she was just adjusting, that she needed time to build momentum. But weeks passed, then months, and the rhythm inside the house shifted in a way that left me carrying more and more of the weight. She started waking up long after I had already finished my morning routines. I'd hear her moving around near 2:30 p.m., and even then, she often drifted straight to the couch. Groceries disappeared faster, the utility bills climbed, and somehow the responsibility for every errand, every chore, every quiet task that keeps a household running landed back on my shoulders. I watched her settle deeper into comfort while I stretched my retirement budget to keep things steady. Whenever I gently nudged her toward work or school, she would shrug it off with a kind of casual confidence that made me second-guess myself. She had a way of framing things that made me feel almost guilty for wanting her to step up. I couldn't tell if she meant to manipulate me, but the effect was the same. I felt myself softening, excusing, enabling. And then there were the little stories that didn't quite line up. A job she claimed she applied for but couldn't remember the details of. A shift she said she worked even though she was home all afternoon. Small things, but they tugged at me. I tried to push the thoughts aside. I didn't want to be suspicious. I didn't want to believe she was capable of taking advantage of me. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. A sense that the truth wasn't matching the picture she kept painting. I didn't know it then, but I was standing right on the edge of a discovery that would change everything. I remember the exact moment everything snapped into focus. It started with a small comment from a friend of mine, someone who works part-time at the same place my granddaughter claimed she'd been picking up shifts. We were chatting casually when she mentioned she hadn't seen my granddaughter there in months. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe their paths simply didn't cross. But the unease I'd been pushing down for weeks stirred again, heavier this time. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table replaying all the little inconsistencies I had ignored. The late mornings, the vague explanations, the way she always seemed to have a reason she couldn't contribute. It was like puzzle pieces finally clicking together, and the picture they formed was nothing like the one she'd been showing me. The real blow came when another acquaintance, someone who handles HR paperwork, quietly mentioned that my granddaughter had filed for unemployment while still living under my roof, claiming she couldn't work, even though she told me she was working part-time. That realization hit me like a punch to the chest. She wasn't just drifting or struggling, she was lying. And she was risking serious trouble while expecting me to unknowingly support the entire thing. I felt this wave of anger wash over me, not the loud kind, but the deep, aching kind that settles in your bones. But beneath it was something sharper, clarity. I had excused too much. I had ignored too much. And now the truth was staring me in the face. I sat there in the quiet, letting the betrayal sink in, knowing I couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine. Something had to change. A line had to be drawn, and I knew the very next step would be setting a boundary she couldn't ignore. I spent the night turning everything over in my mind, feeling the weight of what I had learned pressing down on me. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the truth. I had to protect my home, my peace, and frankly, my own integrity. So I waited until she came upstairs around 2:30 p.m., still moving with that same careless comfort, and I steadied myself. Inside, I felt a storm of hurt and disbelief. But I spoke with a calm I didn't fully feel. I told her that things needed to change, that she couldn't stay here without contributing, and that the lies had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I didn't accuse or shout. I simply laid out the boundaries I should have set months earlier. The shift in her was immediate. It wasn't embarrassment or remorse, it was outrage. She acted as if I was betraying her, as if asking her to take responsibility was some kind of cruelty. She twisted my words, tried to make me question my own judgment, and demanded to know how I could turn on her at a time when she supposedly needed support the most. But this time, something inside me stayed firm. I told her I would no longer carry the weight of her choices, and if she wanted to stay, she had to follow the rules of my home. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. She looked at me with a coldness I had never seen from her, a quiet calculation that sent a chill through me. In that moment, I felt the ground shift again, not from shock this time, but from the certainty that this situation was about to escalate beyond anything I had expected. I thought the silence after our talk was the worst of it, but I was wrong. 2 days later, I walked into my office and felt my stomach drop. Papers were scattered across the desk, drawers left slightly open, and my financial folder, the one I always keep tucked away, was sitting out like someone had been flipping through it. I didn't need to guess who. The violation hit me like a cold wave, the kind that steals your breath before you can even react. When I asked her about it, she didn't deny it. Instead, she tried to twist it into some kind of concerned gesture, saying she needed to understand the household finances if I expected her to contribute. Hearing that justification almost stunned me more than the invasion itself. It was manipulative in a way I hadn't expected from her, deliberate and calculated. Then came the shift. She started throwing around phrases like tenant rights and illegal eviction, as if she suddenly became an expert overnight. She talked about what she was entitled to and what could happen to me if I didn't handle things properly. The tone wasn't fear or confusion, it was threat. That was the moment I felt something harden inside me. Thankfully, I had already spoken with an attorney weeks earlier when the first red flags surfaced, so I knew exactly where I stood and what my rights were. Still, the betrayal cut deep. It was one thing to take advantage of my kindness. It was another to weaponize the law against me in my own home. I tried to keep myself steady, to breathe through the fear, but a darker thought lingered in the back of my mind. If she was willing to go this far, what would she do next? I didn't have to wait long to find out. It was early evening when I heard the knock. Not a gentle tap, but a firm, deliberate knock that made my heart jump. When I opened the door and saw 2 uniformed officers standing on my porch, I felt the air leave my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't even form a thought. I just remember gripping the edge of the door frame to steady myself. They told me they were responding to a welfare check. Someone had reported concerns about my safety, and as soon as the words left their mouths, something inside me cracked open. It didn't take long to understand who had made that call. The timing, the tension in the house, the sudden shift in her behavior, it all pointed in one direction. My own granddaughter had tried to use the police as a weapon. I felt a mix of fear and disbelief wash through me, a cold heaviness settling in my chest. But even through the shock, I managed to speak clearly, to explain that I was perfectly fine, that there had been a misunderstanding. The officers were kind, professional, and after a few minutes, I could see they understood exactly what was happening without me having to say it outright. When they left, the house felt unbearably quiet. I stood there in the doorway, staring at the space where they had just been, and I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, but underneath it, a new kind of strength was taking root. This wasn't just entitlement anymore. This was dangerous. And I knew then that what came next wouldn't be easy, but it was unavoidable. The consequences of her choices were already starting to unfold. The hours after the officers left felt strangely still, as if the whole house was holding its breath with me. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, trying to understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. The hurt was sharp, but beneath it was a steadier truth: if I didn't take responsibility for my own well-being, no one else would. And if I kept ignoring her choices, I would be enabling something far more destructive than just laziness. She tried one last round of manipulation after the police visit. She paced through the house, crying loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, insisting that I had forced her into a corner. She reached out to family members, twisting the story until I barely recognized myself in the version she told. I started getting calls filled with confusion, accusation, and sympathy that didn't belong to the facts. It was exhausting to counter every lie, so at some point I simply stopped trying. I realized the truth didn't need theatrics. It would stand on its own, and it did. The next step was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. I reported the fraud, not out of spite, but because it was the only responsible thing left to do. She had involved my address, my household, my peace, and I couldn't afford to let her drag me into something illegal. It broke my heart to hit submit on that report, knowing it would change her life. But I also knew that shielding her from consequences had only made everything worse. Once the investigation started, the tone of everything shifted. She couldn't spin her way out of paperwork or timelines or missing records. The weight of her choices began settling squarely on her shoulders, not mine. And as painful as it was, a small part of me felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. Not joy, not satisfaction, just the quiet steadiness that comes from finally doing the right thing, even when it hurts. That was the moment everything began to turn, not just for her, but for me too. And in the weeks that followed, something unexpected started to unfold. When the investigation wrapped up and the official consequences landed, the house felt impossibly quiet. She moved out to stay with a distant cousin, and for the first time in months, I could hear myself think. But the quiet didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. I had spent so long trying to hold everything together that when it finally fell apart, all I could do was sit with the weight of it. I loved that girl. I still do. But love doesn't erase the harm that was done or the fear I felt when things spiraled. In the weeks that followed, updates trickled in. She was placed on probation, required to pay back what she had taken, and ordered to attend counseling. At first, I braced myself for anger or more manipulation. Instead, something unexpected happened. She stopped blaming everyone else. She stopped the dramatic stories. She stopped running. According to her probation officer, she started showing up early, asking questions, taking responsibility in small, steady ways. It wasn't a transformation overnight, but it was movement. Real movement. About 2 months later, she reached out. Not with excuses, not with attitude, but with a softness I hadn't heard from her since she was a little girl. She told me she had gotten a job at a local diner, working morning shifts and saving every paycheck. She said the experience had humbled her, scared her, and forced her to see how her choices had hurt the people who loved her most. Hearing that stirred something in me, a mixture of sorrow, relief, and a fragile kind of hope. We agreed to meet in a public place, taking it slow. When she walked in, she looked older, not in a tired way, but in a steadier one. She didn't try to justify a thing. She simply told me she was sorry, and for the first time, I felt the apology reach all the way through. I didn't rush to forgive her, but I opened the door, just enough for light to get through. And that was enough. Over time, our conversations grew easier. Not perfect, not the same as before, but honest. We are rebuilding something new, something shaped by hard lessons and boundaries that will not be crossed again. And somewhere in that long, difficult healing, I realized I had changed too. I found strength I didn't know I had, wisdom I earned the hardest way possible, and a deeper understanding of what love truly requires. This chapter didn't end neatly, but it did end with growth for both of us. And that, I think, is its own kind of peace, leading me into the final reflection I want to share. Looking back on everything, I've learned that love doesn't mean carrying someone at the cost of losing yourself. It means caring enough to set boundaries, even when it hurts. This whole journey challenged me in ways I never expected, but it also reminded me how strong I can be when life demands it. And seeing my granddaughter grow, take responsibility, and find her footing again has been its own quiet blessing. We're not perfect, but we're moving forward with honesty and respect, something I once feared we might never find again. I'm grateful for the peace in my home now, and for the chance to rebuild our relationship on healthier ground. If anything in my story resonates with you, I hope you know you're not alone. Have you ever faced a situation where loving someone meant standing firm for yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone,